The following film is being made for a video history of Columbia County under the auspices of the Dayton Historical Depot Society. Today, November 15th, 1991, we are talking with Annabel Jackson McQuary at her home at 805 East Spring Street. The interview is being conducted by Priscilla Harding, and the camcorder is operated by Dean Smith.
We are talking with Annabel Jackson McQuary this afternoon in her home at 805 East Spring Street. Annabel, a third-generation member of pioneer families in Columbia County, was born here, as were her daughters Rita Ray Dudley and Betty Ann Fletcher. Shall we begin with your grandparents? You mentioned the name Oliphant.
See the red light.
Okay.
That was my granddad's second wife. His first wife, the one that came west with him, she died in 1885 when Dad was about 5 years old. And then he remarried, and she was Annie Oliphant, and they lived up around Pomeroy. And her father was a state legislature or something. He was active in politics anyway. And I remember her as my grandmother, because she more or less raised Dad.
And it was the first wife whose diary you mentioned.
Yeah, we have her
lost.
diary that was written in between 1880 and 1885. And she told of coming west.
Where did they come from?
Osceola, Iowa.
All of them?
The whole family came. Yeah, Dad was born out here, but the other three children were born back there. And they came by train to San Francisco and then by boat up the coast and then on up the river. And that was in the spring of 1879.
That's quite a trip.
It was quite a trip. And he was sick off and on all the time. She said she was glad she came with him, otherwise he would have turned around and gone back home. But as it was, he had his whole family here, so he had to stay. But it took him all that winter, more or less, to get over it. They called it ague, A-G-U-E was the way she spelled it. I suppose it was kind of a flu-like symptom.
I've heard that word used also. How big a family did they have?
They're just the three boys, and then Dad was born out here in 1880. I said I'd forget my dates. Must have been about in 1882.
Now, where did they settle when they?
Well, they came to Dayton first, and they rented rooms in a boarding house for 2 or 3 weeks, and then eventually went up on the mountain. And they had about $10 in provisions with them, and she made arrangements to cook for sawmill workers up there if they would provide the provisions. And that's the way they got through the winter. They had 50 cents in cash.
What would $10 worth of provisions include, you think?
I have no idea. I really don't have any idea. She didn't say anything about that in her diary at all. But she just made the remark that they had about $10 in provisions. I suppose flour and sugar and salt and that sort of thing.
Was this mountain you're referring to Cahill Mountain?
No, Eckler.
Oh, Eckler Mountain.
I think they were on Eckler Mountain.
Okay.
The Cahills were over on Cahill Mountain.
Well, I know the Cahill name is very prominent in your family, and when you say mountain, I always think of Cahill Mountain.
Well, you see, the Cahills, that was my mother's
Yes.
side of the family. And she came up here in 1879 and married Granddad Cahill. She came up first to visit her sister, Sarah McCubbins. And then a year later, she came back and married Granddad. And they lived on Eckler, too.
They actually lived up there?
Yes, the place is still there. We still have the place.
I know there were schools up there in that era.
I guess the girls, they were born and raised up there, and they went to school up on the mountain.
That's your mother and
Mother
her
and
sisters.
her two sisters.
What were some of the occupations of these early people?
Well, I think probably the Jacksons, when they were back there in Iowa and Indiana, were more or less known as cabinet makers. So I think they did a lot of carpenter work. And then after they came out here, it was kind of more or less farming and that sort of thing. And then after Granddad moved down onto the Pataha, he started a sheep ranch. It was sheep that they had. And he and his two brothers, came out together. It was Richard Jackson and John Jackson. And John Jackson more or less settled up around Garfield, or in the Garfield County area. And Albert was his son that lived up there.
Now, are these the men who staked the claim out on the Pataha?
Mm-hmm. And a Kimball, a man by the name of Mr. Kimball.
And this ranch on the Pataha is still in the family, is that
Yeah.
correct?
Mm-hmm.
And they were the sheep raisers?
Yes, they had bands of sheep out there, and then after the sheep was no longer profitable, why they went into cattle.
Backing up a little bit here, you mentioned that your grandparents, some of your great-grandparents rather, were buried in Pomeroy.
Yeah, I think that was why they came out here, maybe, was because their folks came out here originally, but I don't have any history on what exactly they did or anything. I do know that they were buried up at Pomeroy.
Well, I was wondering what the reason was that these people came.
Well, I'm taking it that they more or less followed the parents out here. Originally, the family came from New York.
Oh.
First George Washington Jackson. He was from New York and came out here, or came first to Iowa, and then they came on out here.
But there seemed to be a reason that attracted a lot of people to this part of the country in that era.
Yes, it was, but I don't know the reason. They just wanted the hard life of pioneering, I guess.
Well, I think I've read that the railroad was advertising land availability.
Yes, it was, because that's the land that they homesteaded was railroad land.
Oh, it was?
Mhm.
On the Pataha.
Mm-hmm.
And you've also mentioned that your family were staunch Republicans.
Oh, yes,
Way
you
back.
bet. Clear back. Clear back. The one that came from New York was, I guess, was a strong Republican.
What were some of the cultural activities that they were involved in that era?
My grandparents, I really can't tell you. I don't know. It was a pretty hard life up on the mountain there on the Cahill part. And I know in this diary that my grandmother wrote, she tells about going 3 and 4 months without seeing another white woman. And in one place there she had written that her hair got so long, finally she talked her husband, George Frank Jackson, into cutting it. She says, "Oh my, what a relief." But that old diary was interesting. It was very difficult to read. It's so faded now.
Well, if she said she never saw another white woman, does that suggest that maybe she did see Indians?
No, I don't think there's
No.
never any mention of Indians. No, they just didn't come to town from way out there. And then she told about this smallpox epidemic in Dayton, how that they could come to the age of Dayton, they were not allowed in Dayton.
What year was that?
Oh, it's written up in the histories. I don't know what year it was.
1880s?
It would have been after 1880 because they came in 1879. I would say probably 1882 or 83 along in there. It's written in the histories as the actual date of it. And the town was just buttoned up tight. They could come to the edge of town and get their mail, and that was it. And they could not come into town. And she wrote about making acidity bags for all of her 3 children to wear.
You know what that is?
No, I don't know. She didn't say what it was, but that was what she said she made.
Well, I have heard of a pest house in the community.
She made remarks about that too, I think.
And that, I think, is in relation to the smallpox
It was the
epidemic.
smallpox
Yeah.
epidemic.
Yeah. Well, their social life probably was pretty much family-centered.
It was. Mm-hmm.
Although there were a lot more families living on the mountain then than there are now.
Well, this was, of course, after they moved down. They just stayed the one winter on the mountain.
Oh, I see.
And then they moved down. He took out his homestead there on the between the Pataha and the Toucannon,
Oh,
and he established his place there. I know I tried when they had these Centennial Farm wards. I tried to get Betty Ann to trace back to try and find the deed, and we couldn't find it. I mean, well, it wasn't a state then. It was Washington Territory, and I would have had to go through Walla Walla, and I just didn't go through all that to find it. But it's been in the family that long.
were any of your grandparents involved in civic activities?
Well, I really don't remember. Yes, Granddad was mayor of Dayton for a while. They spoke of that.
Now, that was Jackson, is that right?
Yeah, that was George Frank Jackson.
Okay. Well, then they must have moved into Dayton by then.
Yeah, he did. Well, let's see. That was after he had retired from the sheep ranch. That was after that was after he married Miss Oliver. That was after Dad's own mother had died, and they moved in. And they lived over on Dayton Avenue someplace. I don't know the exact house. But they were active in different lodges and things like that.
Lodges being,
Oddfellows, and
was there a moose lodge here?
I don't hear that mentioned, but I think they were active in the Oddfellows.
Are there any other anecdotes or special memories you have about your grandparents that you'd like to talk about?
No, I really don't remember them too much. As far as my granddad, well, I remember my granddad Cahill, because they lived there on First Street just above us, and they had a cow, and we loved to go over so we could have a glass of warm milk at night. Charlotte maybe mentioned all of that.
A little, but not, she didn't go into detail. There was something you were telling me a while ago that she didn't mention about the Cahill.
Yeah, well, Granddad, of course, had this place on the mountain, and that's still in the family. And they bought a place adjoining. We called it the old McLean place. And in the summer, the family would use that for outings and stuff, so forth. And we had beds and things up there, could stay overnight. We'd go up and as I said, they had a whole row of currant bushes, and we had to pick currants every summer, and we kids all hated it. And I don't think I like jelly to this day for that very reason. And then one time, all a bunch of us, all us grandkids, were up, and we were playing in a culvert up above the house there. We thought it was great fun to pick up the clods of dirt and throw at cars. And some car stopped and told Grandpa about it. Grandpa got us all cornered, and we got an awful talking to, and to this day I don't think any of us forgot it.
What kind of cars were in use then?
Well, this was would have been in the
20s?
late 20s. Yeah, there were cars. Folks had a car, and Grandpa and Grandma had a car and all. They were far cry from what our cars are today, but no, there were cars.
Yeah.
And I know there's a line of fir trees out behind the house. I can still see it. And the boys built a tree house up in it.
Now this is on the mountain.
Yeah, this is my brother and his cousin. They're from Walla Walla and whatnot, from the mountain. They had their tree house, and that was where we'd go play.
Well, Charlotte did tell us the story of the lone fir tree up there.
Well, now that was the Cahill. That was not the grandparents' Cahill. That was more W.E. Cahill's family that started that. She knows more about that history on that than I do, because I've never been that interested in the Cahill tree.
I do understand that the Cahills came out of Willamette Valley.
That was my grandmother's people. Stevens, it was the Hanson Stevens. They come across by wagon train and settled down in the Willamette Valley. And that's where my grandmother was born, was down there. And then she came up to Dayton to visit that time, as I said, and met Granddad. And was married then, came back and married him. Her wedding dress is still down at the depot, you know.
Yes.
And my granddaughter modeled that 2 summers ago.
That's quite remarkable. Usually they were such tiny little.
Well, she is tiny, and even so, the dress was tiny on her. I mean, it was tight on her. If I put it right, it was tight on her. So I don't know. My grandmother must have been a very small woman.
Did your grandmothers play cards and things of that sort? Or social activities, or belong to social clubs and so on?
No, my mother did.
But not your grandparents?
But I can't remember my grandparents really. I don't know what they did as far as, you know, getting together. I think it was mostly picnics and things like that in the summertime.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll move on to your parents. Who were George Jackson and
Ida Cahill Jackson.
Ida Cahill Jackson.
And they were both born and raised in Columbia County.
About what years were they born?
I should have looked that up.
Well, 1860s, 70s, 80s, or long in there.
1880 something, I would say. Mother graduated from high school up here in 1909.
That was one of the very early graduating classes.
Yes,
then.
I think hers was about the 3rd or 4th graduating class.
What were the occupations of your parents? I expect your mother was a homemaker.
Oh yes, she never worked. She was a homemaker.
But your father?
Say she never worked. She worked hard, but she was not in downtown. No, Dad, of course, was in the bank down there for years. He was on Main Street over 50 years. And then after he left the bank, he had bought the Hamilton Hardware and moved up to that.
Well, you talked a little bit about your father. He said while he was in school, he was a printer's devil. Now, what is a printer's devil?
Well,
is that at a local newspaper?
yes, it was a local newspaper. They set up the print. Isn't that what the printer's devil does?
I'm not sure.
I think that's what he does.
Okay.
And at the time, Dad was about, well, he was, I would say he was probably in about equivalent of the 8th grade. He was ready to go into high school. And somebody, I think a Mr. Rice he was called, he was trying to find somebody to work down at the bank. Well, then of course he was working as a printer's devil. And then so whoever it was he'd asked, they advised him to maybe take Dad and start him. And that was, he didn't go finish school. He just went through the 8th grade and that was it.
My word, he was truly a self-made man.
He was.
Wasn't he?
He went into the banking business and boy, figures were just natural to him, I guess.
Well, now about how old would he have been if he'd just gone through the 8th grade?
Well, of course they
14 or
don't
15?
Huh?
14 or 15?
Oh no, he'd have been 17 or 18.
Oh.
I think. Because, you know, see, their schooling was so broken up.
Oh, yes. In the wintertime.
In the wintertime, they didn't always get to school and whatnot. I don't really know where he went to school. I suppose out there on the Petaha someplace, because there was a school out there. But there's never been any mention of the schooling he did before he come into town to go to school. And of course, he might have got it all here in town, because his dad they did move into town over on Dayton Avenue then.
So at about the age of 17 or 18, he went to work in the bank. And
I would say that.
He stayed.
And that's where he stayed all those years until he quit and went up to his hardware store.
What was the name of that bank?
Columbia National.
Columbia National Bank.
I've still got a little savings with Columbia National Bank on it.
He was very active in civic affairs.
He was. Yes, he was very active. So,
Can you tell us some of the things that he did? Was he on the city council, for instance?
I presume maybe he wasn't, I don't know. He handled the Patrisky Fund for how many years? 30 or 40 years. He was chairman of it.
Will you explain what the Patrisky Fund
Well, it's
is?
the fund that, for the ag department up at the school. And the building, the ag building up there now, was built with Patrisky money.
And it's dedicated to George Jackson.
Yeah, to Dad. He was, and I can remember when they had that dedication, Dad sat up there on the stage and he chewed gum, and I had never in my life seen him chew gum before. He really worked that wad of gum over. He was so nervous.
Well, when I asked you about the Patrisky Fund, I was trying to get at who Mr. Patrisky was.
Well, he was a doctor here in Dayton, and he left his money to the school system, I think. In fact, the house that I went to, the third or fourth grade to, was the Patrisky house up there about where the ag building sits now.
Oh,
And that was their home, and I think they must have left that to the school. They had no children. It's pretty well written up in one of the history books, I'm sure.
now, what were some of the cultural activities that your parents were involved in?
Well, they liked to play cards, and they had a group of friends that they had an awful good time with, partying and whatnot. And,
Were there lots of dances on that day?
well, I don't know whether you'd say there were dances or what. I don't know. They just, I've got pictures of them, or groups of them, you know, that from parties and things. And one picture I know I have, or I don't know whether I've got it now, but I've seen it. And it was in the house that Woodard's owned next door down there. It's where, who lives there now, Mike?
Marinella?
Where's?
Well, it's the Smith place down there on First Street.
Marinella.
Marinella.
Oh,
Mhm.
yes.
And it shows them all lined up there, and I think they were giving a minstrel show or something. For some of them were blacked up, which they wouldn't dare do now, and they just plain they made their own fun.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was, I know Dad would go downtown not every night, but quite often after work, and there was what they called the commercial club, and it was up where the Eagles is now, up over there in those buildings, and they fellows would play cards. That was the night that he had been stung with bees. And he sat there playing cards, and he began to feel very funny, and finally he says, I think I'd better go home. He got downstairs and started up First Street, and Dr. Barnett was in the house where the phone office is now. He fell in the door, and unfortunately Dr. Barnett was there and gave him a shot of adrenaline and brought him out of it. But it was really a close call.
Had he had problems with bee stings before?
I don't know.
But
He had
keeping
a
the bees
beehive.
himself, wasn't
Huh?
he? He was the beekeeper himself.
Yeah, he
wasn't
was a beekeeper, and he was out fiddling with him.
Uh-huh.
And one time he had goats out behind the house there. They got out, and Hugh had the family had to go chase goats all over Rock Hill.
Oh, God. Well, everybody along First Street had some
They-
livestock of some kind, didn't they?
The lots down there all go clear back to the creek.
Mhm.
And so it was not unusual to have cow or horses or something. Well, they still do some of them down there.
Well, some of the barns and outbuildings are still there.
Yeah, the barn's still behind the folks' house is still there. At least it was the last time I looked.
Do you have any special memories about your parents that you'd like to share with us? You haven't talked much about your mother. Did she belong to?
Yeah,
Ladies'
she belonged
groups?
to what they called the Monday Sewing Club. It was a group of women. They met on Monday, and they had their little sewing projects. She was a charter member of the Elizabeth Fourth Day Club,
Uh-huh.
Draper Club it was called then.
And it's still in existence.
And it still exists in existence. And she played bridge. They had a bridge club. And And she was active over in the church organizations too. Oh, she was busy.
Did they get involved in school activities?
Well, I don't know. They didn't involve parents in the school so much. I really don't remember that. I can remember when I started the first grade clear over on Dayton Avenue in that house. When I was about in the second grade, they got a little too crowded, so they sent 4 of us up onto 4th Street to the school up there. So
Way out on 4th Street.
it's way out. It's where Jim Munden lives now, up there in that old house. So she decided she'd walk up to see how far that was that her little girl had to walk. She got up there, and Carmen Israel was the teacher. She informed her they'd sent her the 4 dumbest kids they had over there. So Mother came home madder than a hatter.
But you stayed in school,
I stayed in school. I stayed in school.
Are all of these people that we've talked about buried up here in our...
Yeah. Yeah, they are.
Now you yourself have 2 brothers, is that?
Hugh and Frank. Hugh's gone.
That's right.
And Frank is down, well, he spends summers in Walla Walla and the winters in Yuma.
We just missed him, didn't we?
You just missed him. I wished you'd have started this a little earlier. I'd have cornered him and got him up here.
Before we get too much into your personal life, I wondered if we should talk about the sheep ranch anymore. I don't know what to ask you about.
Well, Frank, and it's too bad Frank isn't here. He probably can remember more about that. I can remember going out there to visit, because my uncle and his wife and all of their children lived there. And I can remember when would they do that? In the spring? Yes, in the spring they would take sheep back to Chicago. They would round them all up and load them on box cars. And one time Hugh got to go with them back there, and that was, of course, after he was a teenager. And that was a highlight of his year that year.
Now, where were the sheep loaded onto the boxcars?
Out where the shop, or the place is there.
Right there at the ranch?
There was a siding there, Jackson Siding it was called. In fact, Wilma Fletcher has a picture in that Columbia County history she wrote, and she has it more or less, when you read it, you'd think that belonged to the R.A. Jacksons. But I looked at it and I thought, that was taken out on the Petawaha. So that was where they loaded them. Of course, there isn't a railroad there now. They've pulled up the railroad now.
How many sheep did they run about?
Oh, God, I don't know. I have no idea.
It was a large band.
Yes, that was a large band.
Well, now, did they take those sheep to the mountains?
In the mountains in the summertime.
Local mountains, or did they have to go up into Montana?
No, they went up and headed Toucan and up in there, because I can remember in the summertime going up there with my cousins to the sheep camp that they had up there. And in fact, one of the times I was up there, and I don't know if other people remember Louis Spellinger, but he was working up there for them. He went out, he gigged a salmon. And of course, I was young enough, that made a big impression on me. And that was quite an experience to go out and stay, overnight up there. We'd make our bed with the boughs on the ground. And
well, I suppose they had a camp cook and all.
Well, I think my aunt did most of that. I think she did the cooking up there in the summertime.
About how many people were there?
It would be just family.
Oh.
They'd have a few hired men. They had to have their sheep herders, but no, it was mostly just family that would take. They'd have to have help getting them up there, but after they were up there, they were.
Well, now, did those sheep have to come back through town? And so they were driven right through town.
They driven right through town. The Trudgeons drove theirs right through town too.
I remember the sheep bands going through town. In later years, people took their sheep up into Montana in the summertime.
Yes, they did finally got to where there's enough. I don't know why they changed and went up, but that would have been quite a process to get them up into Montana. I think the Drews did that more. You see, after my uncle left the ranch out there, then Drews rented the ranch for a while.
Which Drew was that?
Ramey, I think. One of the Drews. I really don't know. There were quite a few of them.
Most of them were involved with sheep, weren't
Yes, they were all involved with sheep. And then after they left, well, then it went to a cattle ranch, and John Harding was out there with his cattle, for a number of years.
Now, does that ranch extend from the Pataha all the way over to the Snake River?
Uh-huh.
About how many acres?
Around 6,000, I think.
Was
Don't
that-
quote me on that, I probably get it wrong.
Well, you said, I think. Was that the original land grant?
Well, they just kept adding to it, I think. I don't know how much the original land grant was, but they kept adding to it until finally it was around 6,000 acres he had. And it was, as I said, it was all homesteaded, more or less. It was
It's all dry land.
all dry land. Well, no, I'll take it back. We do have an irrigated spot down there along the Pataha now.
Right, now you do. Well, getting back to you, you went to school here and graduated from this
I graduated
high school here.
in 31.
Did you have an occupation?
No, not really.
I thought you had worked.
Well, I did. I kept booked for Dad at the store for years, but other than that, that was the only
That's
thing.
an occupation.
Well, that's an occupation. I grant just an occupation.
And you were on Main Street.
Huh?
And you were on Main
Oh
Street.
yes, I was on Main
Yeah.
Street.
Do you have any special memories about what Main Street was like when you were young? Like right out of high school and you went to work for your dad?
Well, I didn't go right to work out of high school for Dad. You see, I had my kids, and then they needed a bookkeeper at the store. So, and then after I'd left, separated from Burl, I said, well, I would try that. And so that was when I went to work for him. But Betty Ann was 10, 12 years old by that time. And all I can remember Main Street as it was,
Well, tell us about that.
and the drugstores that we hung out at to go get our Coke ever so often. And
There were two of them, weren't there?
yes, there were two of them at that time. And then what was the mission? It was Minimo's, or what was that? Kind of forgotten that. The Big Dipper. That was what I'm trying to think of, the Big Dipper. That was where the kids liked to go for. Of course, by that time, my girls were up to where that was where they hung out. And,
That was about across the street from the courthouse.
yes, it was. It was in that area.
There was also a theater that
Yes.
functioned.
Yeah, I can remember going to movies there. I don't think I've been to a movie since that much.
What are some of the other places on Main Street that no longer exist?
Well, Edwards and Hindle's where we shopped, and they had their grocery store and dry goods, clothing. And that's where I got most of my clothing, and that was at Edwards's. And then the meat market across the street there. Who had that?
Chandler's.
Chandler's, And see one time what was it? There was a epidemic of some sort, and everything was shut up tight. That seemed to be the way they took care of things then. I can't remember what that was. It was in the winter time, and Lordy, there were a lot of deaths from it. Won't tell you, I guess, can't think.
There was a penny store in town.
Yes, there was a penny store. Well, and there was up Fixes. They had a clothing store or some kind of a dry goods store. And that was about where the theater is now, or up in that area. Above it. It was where Bob McQuary has his.
Oh, was it?
It was in that area, yeah, right in there. And then of course Boone's had some some clothing and stuff like that, mostly work clothing, and they had a grocery store there. And that was down kind of where, well, it's more or less where Jenny Butler's revived that building. It was right along in there.
There weren't really any empty buildings on Main Street.
No, there were not, not like it is today anyway. So,
Well, after high school, you married and raised your family, and then went to work for your dad. Now, I know that you were a charter member of Benevolencia. Is that a group that you especially enjoyed?
Oh my, yes.
You're still involved in it?
Yeah. In fact, I had them the day we had that dirt storm up here.
What kinds of things do the Benevolencia ladies do now?
Well, we're not very active now. We still are still interested in everything. I mean, we have to have a program. Each person is responsible for a program. And then we have what we call current affairs during the business meeting. And anybody that has read anything in the paper that is of interest, where we discuss that. And we mostly just kind of relaxed and having a good time now. We're 50-some years old. We figure we can be that way after being with each other that long.
Well, do you still take on money-making projects?
No.
But you used to do
We used to. We used to.
What are some of the other organizations that you belong to that you enjoy?
I play bridge, but that's it.
That's the only organized activity.
Well, of course, I work with church too, but I'm active in that. But no, I play bridge at least once or twice a week. Got to keep my mind going somehow. So.
That's a good way to keep sharp.
That's what I think. So.
Have you ever been involved in civic activities?
Not too much, no. I've helped a little with during presidential elections and things like that, but no.
For the Republican Party, of course.
I don't get involved with anything too much like that.
Any other special activities that you?
Oh, just keeping track of all my grandkids. And
how many?
11. See, I married Burl in '55, and he had 3 children.
I see.
And they lived with us. So all of those kids, I'm Grandma Annabel to them. So.
Any special memories that you'd like to share with us, or like where you went to school when you were young?
Well, we went to high school up here.
Well, you talked about.
Well, as I said, I started over on Dayton Avenue. The little house over there. I don't know. I can't even place the house now.
But you lived on First Street.
I lived on First Street. Dad and Mother were married in 1906. They built a house. Well, they'd been in the process of building it, and it's still down there on First Street. It's 30. I don't know. Anyway, it's where Ann Mickelson lives now. They lived there for 50-some years. That was their home. They were married 52 years, I think, when they died, and that was their home, and they built it.
And you went from there over to Dayton Avenue, and then from Dayton Avenue you were sent up to 4th Street.
Yeah, and then after that back down to where the Central School is now. That house, it was a Patrisky. I'm sure that it was Dr. Patrisky's home, and our 4th grade was in there. And then from there we went over into the grade school building.
Was the Central grade school there all the time, and they just didn't have room for the
I guess so.
primaries?
It was always there, but I don't know why they had us all over town.
Well, I guess maybe the high school was in that building too.
The high school
wasn't
was upstairs in that
Okay.
central building. You see, that's where Mother graduated from.
it? Well, that explains that after the high school was built, as
Yeah,
a separate
then
building,
they
they had all the grade schools.
Put all the grade schools back into the main building.
That explains that. And you grew up on First Street
Yep,
with your cousin Charlotte.
yeah. And Sarah Lyman next door.
Uh-huh. Are there any other stories about First Street you'd like to share with us?
Well, we had an awful good time on First Street. The gang of us would get out and play, and I think of these kids and all the trouble they get into raising cane, and we never even had time for that. We were too busy out playing Run Sheep Run and skating and stuff like that. So.
Did most of the kids have bicycles as well?
Oh yes, we all had bicycles
And roller skates?
and roller skates.
Does
And
the
anything my brothers could do, I could do.
Does the street look pretty much today as it did then?
Very much. It hasn't changed that much.
Most of the houses along there were built in at least your parents' time, weren't they, or prior
Oh, yeah.
to that? And they're still there.
I was going to say, most of, Charlotte and I walked up and down that street
Yes.
one day, and we could just put in a name where, whose house is this and this and this going up the street. No, it's very much the same. The only thing that's changed is they took that old house down that was the original Laura's day home, you know, on where the telephone office is now.
Oh, yes. That was the founders.
That was a Jesse Day's, that's what I'm trying to think of, Jesse Day. It was their home that they built. And they, of course, tore that down. That was a crime, that house wasn't saved. It was a beautiful old house. And that is gone. And then there was a little old house in there where Don Hatfield has his house now. He bought that, and he tore that down and then built back in further.
Was that little house he took down something of historic?
It was not much of a house. Paul and Doris Nelson lived there a long time. And some of the, it seemed like Dean and Adelaide Wallace lived there a short while too. It was not much of a house. It was just really a shack.
Which is probably the oldest house on First Street.
Well, I don't know. Probably Maxine's house there, because that was, my grandparents bought that when they moved down from the mountain, and that would have been in 19 and, because grandmother went to school up there, graduated in 1909. I would imagine that house was built in the 1900s. About.
That was a Cahill home.
Well, yeah, but they bought it from, one of the Days built it for their daughter, and Granddad bought it from them.
But it was the Cahills who lived
Yes,
there.
it was a Grandpa and Grandma Cahill's place.
Well, we want to thank you for this very pleasant
Well,
chat.
I hope I got my dates straight and some of my facts straight. Somebody comes along and say, no, that wasn't the way it happened at all.
Well, everybody remembers things a little differently.
They sure do.
Yeah.